Metroid Fusion is a game that leaves me very conflicted. On one hand, I love so many things about it, like the improvements made to the gameplay that make controlling the game more intuitive than Super Metroid, the absolutely amazing atmosphere that really taps into that ominous and foreboding feeling that Metroid is so good at emphasizing. But then on the other hand, I'm not that big a fan of the story. I don't like how often progress is halted by long, unskippable cutscenes, and worst of all, I hate just how railroaded and ultimately linear this game is. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my Metroid Fusion review. The core gameplay of Metroid Fusion is excellent. The controls have been mostly improved from Super Metroid, most notably in the movement department. Super Metroid's movement was slow and extremely floaty, making precise platforming a little tricky. Thankfully, Metroid Fusion completely overhauled the way Samus feels. In this game, she's a lot faster and she actually has some weight to her jumps now. She controls like a dream in this game. This game is actually now the basis for how 2D Metroid games controlled, with these controls being perfected in Zero Mission. Another improvement is the way the weapons are selected. Super Metroid had this really clunky item select mechanic, where pressing the select button cycle through your items, but in very intense situations, trying to cycle through all these items just did not feel right. Metroid Fusion amends this issue by completely forgoing the item select and simplifying it so that simply holding the R button causes Samus to switch to her missiles, and holding R while in Morph Ball makes her use the power bombs. The added smoothness to the way Samus controls allows the game a lot more freedom when it comes to the combat, and this game takes full advantage of that, with some of the best bosses in the series. But before we get to that, I have to mention that the controls aren't a complete improvement, and a lot of the advanced movement mechanics from Super Metroid have been removed. This is actually a symptom of a much larger problem with Metroid Fusion as a whole. The main mechanics that were removed were the bomb jump and the ability to wall jump off of a single wall. These mechanics are primarily used for speedrunning, but even in a casual playthrough, many players will take advantage of these mechanics to sequence break and say get an item a little bit earlier than intended. I find that sequence breaking is actually a big part of Metroid's appeal, at least in the dedicated Metroid fanbase. The removal of these mechanics doesn't really add anything to the gameplay. They only serve to take away freedom from the player, which hinders this game's already very low exploration value, as this game is the most linear of the 2D Metroids. As I mentioned earlier, this game has some really outstanding bosses. They all pose a threat to the player, and you can't really beat these bosses in a war of attrition like you could in other Metroid games. They all have distinct patterns and strategies that the player needs to learn and keep track of. These definitely aren't the type of bosses you beat on your first try. Metroid Fusion in general is a harder experience than a lot of other Metroid games. In this game, Samus loses her power suit, and as such, she takes like double the damage she usually does. And the enemies in this game, the X-Parasites, not only come in bigger groups, but they are also more aggressive, and upon killing them, they revert back into their parasitic form and can merge with other X to become even more powerful. The X as enemies are pretty awesome. As someone that enjoys a proper challenge in games, I greatly enjoy the added difficulty that Metroid Fusion provides. The atmosphere in this game is absolutely incredible and immersive, which for a pixelated GBA game, I say is pretty impressive. Every sector of the station is packed full of detail, the environments are so lovingly crafted that sometimes you can't help but just stand around and soak it all in. The music in this game is honestly a hit or miss for me, but all the atmospheric tracks are really well done, and some of the boss tracks are excellent, with some of my favorite tracks being Sector 4's Water theme, which is playing in the background right now, and the boss theme for Nightmare. Speaking of Nightmare, this game's atmosphere lends itself very well to the horror elements of science fiction, and probably the best example of this is the SAX. For those of you that have played Resident Evil 3, the good one, then you'll be very familiar with the type of enemy the SAX is. The SAX chases you periodically throughout the game for some very intense chase sequences. The SAX can't be killed, only slowed down with ice missiles, and if it catches up to you, then you're pretty much automatically dead. The moments with the SAX are brief, but very well executed moments of tension, and tension is what this game does extremely well. For example, Nightmare is teased many times throughout the game. You see it flying around in the background, and then when you go to fight it, you see nothing but absolute destruction. And it's the game's way of telling the player that this enemy is not to be trifled with. Perhaps you could say this game is good at giving the player a sense of dread. Oh boy, hold on to your butts everybody, because I'm about to get a little controversial. Here we go. So far, this video has been mainly positive on Metroid Fusion, and that's for good reason. This game has a lot to love about it. However, I rarely, if ever, come back to replay this game because there are some flaws in this game that I think ruined the experience, especially on repeat playthroughs. Those flaws being the story and how the game is structured around it. Metroid Fusion, more than any game up to this point, places a huge emphasis on the story, which by itself isn't a bad thing. I love stories of video games, especially if the story and gameplay meld together in unison and plays to the strengths of the medium. Unfortunately, Metroid Fusion does not do that. In fact, I would say that the story of Metroid Fusion unequivocally gets in the way of the gameplay. The way the game is structured around the story is that throughout the entire game, Samus is accompanied by an AI companion who she names Adam because it reminds her of her former commanding officer. Adam acts as your navigator, telling you information about the sectors and showing you where to go next. I think this is a huge problem. As for me, a big part of the appeal of Metroid is being able to explore off the beaten path, and in Metroid Fusion, that's simply not possible, because at every chance the game gets, it halts your progress to show you an unskippable cutscene telling you where to go next. There's no feeling of exploration, there's no feeling of discovery that Metroid can and has done before. It ultimately leaves the game feeling extremely stale on repeat playthroughs, and all the cutscenes are total pace breakers. And that's not even the only problem either. I probably wouldn't be so hard on this aspect of the game if the story itself was any good, but unfortunately, I don't think that's the case either. Metroid Fusion's story is painfully uninteresting. They try to dive deeper into Samus' character, but I don't think it works all too well. She's constantly monologuing about the things she's seen and experienced, but I don't think it adds anything to the story. Because in my opinion, Samus thinking to herself is a role that's usually filled by the player as they explore the world, using Samus as a sort of self-insert. The Metroid Prime games are a good example of this. And I'm not completely against the thought of Samus being her own fully fleshed out character, but there are better ways of doing it than this. And her whole relationship with Adam in this game, I just find really cringy, I guess is the word to describe it. Especially when she goes into the whole, he called her lady in a dignified way, I just can't get behind it. Maybe Other M retroactively ruined this aspect of the story, but who knows. All I can really say is that I'm just not that big fan of this game's story. It interrupts the flow of gameplay, isn't interesting, and ruins any type of replay value this game could have had. Metroid Fusion isn't a bad game by any means. As we discussed all throughout this video, there is plenty to love about it. However, the flaws present in this game's structure and story stop it from truly being one of those legendary titles. With that being said, thank you for watching, follow my Twitch channel, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll see you in my next video.